Welcome to the Wealthy Life Club Masterclass. I'm Sybil Verch, host of The Wealthy Life. Our 30-minute masterclasses are designed to educate and empower you to make smart decisions and live your version of a wealthy life. You don't need to be rich to live a wealthy life. It's all about making the most out of what you have. Today, we're going to discuss how to navigate divorce. This session is for those of you that are currently separated or maybe about to separate, and divorce is the most likely outcome. This can be a really overwhelming time from not only an emotional perspective, but also has considerable implications on your finances and maybe family if you've got kids involved. We're going to cover the basics of what you need to know to protect yourself and to help ensure a smoother separation process, divorce process. If you have any questions, specific questions you want answered today, just enter it in either the chat or the Q&A box down below, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Now, I've got to put an important disclaimer in here. As always, this webinar is for information purposes only. There's different rules, different laws, I guess, in different provinces. So please do seek independent professional advice before taking any action. And I'm now pleased to introduce family lawyer Allison Dennis. Allison's practice encompasses all areas of family law, including complex property and support issues, parenting disputes, separation agreements, marriage contracts, and cohabitation agreements. Now, while Allison is an experienced litigator, her experience with the court system has made her all too well aware of the financial and emotional cost of high conflict. You know, it can affect the kids, it can affect yourself, everybody involved. And so while the court system really is a necessary and important tool for resolving disputes in many situations, Allison is also focused on alternative dispute resolution, such as mediation, arbitration, and parenting coordination. And she's developed a playbook of options for assisting her clients to achieve a resolution of their disputes. Well, welcome, Allison. You're the expert. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Now, where are you connecting from today?
I'm connecting from my office in Toronto, where we're located at Midtown Toronto.
Great. Well, welcome.
Young and St. Clair area.
We've got people all over the country joining us today. So I know some of the things you'll talk about may be more specific to the province of Ontario. We may touch on some other provinces as well. But we'll just add little disclaimers in along as we need to. But where do people start? I think, you know, if they're just going through a separation or they're about to separate, what do they need to know? Where do they start?
So that's true. So I do practice law in Ontario, and the laws are different from province to province. But what is not different is what to do when you first separate. So the first thing you're going to do when you separate most likely is speak to a lawyer, and you can have a consultation with a lawyer. Generally speaking, lawyers charge for consultations. Some offer free consultations. I really recommend meeting with more than one lawyer. I think it's a good idea to talk to more than one person. This is somebody who's going to be a very important person in your life, and how they manage your case is going to make a big difference. So it's important to make sure you have a good fit with that person. You really want to know sort of something about their reputation. So if you can ask your friends, have they had a good experience with a lawyer that they used in a separation? I think, you know, any insight that you can get into that in that person would be useful. You also want to find out more about what their practice style is. So, you know, if you're somebody who really wants an amicable separation, you're going to look for a lawyer who's in line with those goals, right?
Oh, that's important.
So you're going to meet with that. Absolutely, it really is. And, you know, sometimes you'll look on a lawyer's website and you can see right there that they're involved in, you know, things like collaborative practice or mediation, or so you can tell some things from looking at a lawyer's online profile. And you can also ask them, you know, how do they typically try to resolve disputes in their practice, or what do they think might be a good way to resolve disputes amicably in your case specifically. And I think it's also important during the consultation that you talk about that. What is the plan for the case? What are the options for how you might want to resolve things?
Yeah, because if you can't resolve things, it's a lengthy battle and probably a costly one. So when you're picking a lawyer, looking for someone that's going to help make things go as smoothly as possible, where you can, uh, will help save costs. Am I right on that?
Yeah, and yes, and cost is also going to be directly related to how long your case goes on for, how acrimonious it is. There is a relationship, of course, between cost and complexity. So if you have a lot of assets or a lot of businesses, things like that, it's going to be more costly and more complicated to resolve your case. But I'd say more often than not, what causes costs to be higher is the level of conflict between the parties. So if you can, nip that in the bud as much as possible and try to resolve things, you know, that doesn't mean you're going to agree on everything. You're not going to
Hmm.
agree on everything. There's going to be areas of dispute. It's just how do you resolve those disputes that matters in a way that doesn't escalate the conflict, right?
Yes.
And another thing to be mindful about, obviously, when choosing a lawyer is going to be their rate and how they structure the services that they're going to perform for you. So, for example, bigger firms tend to have a senior lawyer and then a junior lawyer working on the file. Not always, but that's a lot of the time how that works. So you'll have to think about that. Do you prefer to work only with your lawyer, or do you want a team of lawyers where one lawyer has a lower rate and another lawyer has a higher rate? And you want to ask about that up front at the meeting. Who's going to be working on my file? Is it going to be the $800 an hour lawyer? Or is it going to be the $300 an hour lawyer? And you're going to want to
Right.
know who you're going to be dealing with, right? When you retain that firm. So that's an important question to ask as well. And, if you can also choose a smaller firm or a sole practitioner, depending on what kind of service model meets your needs. And there's advantages and disadvantages to both.
So how about
So
for the
larger
couple that,
firms can be.
sorry, go ahead, Allison. Larger firms can
No,
be
I was just going to say sometimes larger firms have, more resources, and sometimes it's better to have that one-on-one relationship with the lawyer throughout the whole duration of the case.
great. And I think, how about some of those couples who think, oh, we don't want to get lawyers involved because we don't want to pay the fees and we're going to get along and we're going to just decide it all for ourselves. And like, have you seen that happen? Does it work sometimes where people can just agree on everything and do they still need a lawyer?
So I'm sure that happens. I don't usually see those people because they're not the ones who are coming to me. But what I can say about that is if you have an agreement with your spouse that's done without lawyers, it can be subject to attack later on if the parties didn't have things like independent legal advice and they didn't exchange disclosure. So you have to be careful doing that you are doing things that are consistent with the law on domestic contracts, because otherwise you might be facing a challenge down the road. Also, the terms of your domestic contracts may not be consistent with the law, and you may run into trouble later on if you try to vary that contract, or that contract may not be worth the paper it's written on, assuming you do have a contract, which I'm just assuming you would in that situation. But
Right.
because I'm a lawyer, I think that it's better to have a lawyer to give you advice on your legal position for sure. I mean, many times clients will come to me with an agreement. Obviously, I only represent one of the two spouses, but they will come to you with the terms that they're comfortable with. And there's usually no objection to that as long as they understand what they're agreeing to and they've had disclosure. That one of the great things about an amicable separation is you can have creative solutions and you can agree to things that you want to agree to without the input of the court. You just come to your own agreement.
Yeah, but it's understanding and learning what you need to learn, knowing what your rights are, because I think sometimes people maybe are one party or the other might be more generous than they needed to be, but didn't know that at the time. So I agree. I think it's very important to get a legal opinion. But if you and your partner or ex can agree on things, then obviously that's going to go a lot smoother. I want to jump into a little bit of the mechanics a bit because I think there's a lot of confusion over the process of getting divorced. It's not like you wake up one morning and go, I want a divorce, we're divorcing, and boom, you go in and get your divorce. There's a separation period, I believe. How does that work?
That's right. So the divorce is really just the end of the marriage. So the marriage ends with divorce. But first you have to separate. And the date of separation or the valuation date is the date where you separate with no reasonable prospect of resuming cohabitation. And what that means is there's a definitive end of the relationship. And most often, and that is a legal separation. People are very confused about what is a legal separation.
Yeah.
So you are legally separated when there has been a definitive separation and there's no reasonable prospect of reconciliation. So you do not need a separation agreement to be legally separated. What you do need, though, is for there to be some form of notice of an intention to separate. So usually that's a conversation or one party telling the other party that they wish to separate in a definitive way. Not always, right? Sometimes we have blurry lines, we have multiple
Mhm.
conversations and reconciliations, and it's not always clear. There's a lot of um, litigation over dates of separation, unclear dates of separation. So if I had to give advice on that, I would say if you are planning to separate, it would be a good idea to have a definitive conversation. Most people don't do this in writing, but if a lot of time goes by or you continue to live together, you don't have to be physically separated in order to have a legal separation. So you can still be in the same house. You can even be sleeping in the same bed. It's
Mm.
just, it has to be known to both of you that you are in fact separated, and there has to be no attempts at reconciliation that that makes it unclear that you're not separated. So
Yeah.
if you could make that as definitive and formal as possible, it's going to avoid any conflict over dates of separation
And
issues in the
why does
future.
that matter? Like, why does the data separation matter?
The
Like,
date of
what are the
separation,
implications?
so there's a few. So the main one is property division. So the date of separation is in Ontario legislation, the date called the valuation date. So that's the date when property is valued for married people for the purposes of equalization. And the date of separation is the date when properties are valued for the purposes of property division generally. And so that date is the date when your assets are crystallized for the purposes of sharing assets with your spouse. So
Mhm.
that's why there's a lot of litigation and disagreement over what that date is, because sometimes it can have significant implications for the value of property that's shared, right?
Yeah.
Now, if property is in both names, if it's jointly owned, then that doesn't matter because you're an owner of the property. It's only the property that's in your spouse's name where the date of separation matters.
So I think of
Uh,
something like debt, credit cards, or a joint bank account where you're both accessing money. Maybe it's got a big line of credit attached to it. What if one spouse starts spending and racking up a bunch of debt and the other doesn't? How does that affect the division of assets after the fact? And is there anything people need to do to protect themselves from that?
Okay, so post-separation spending is generally accounted for in post-separation adjustments. Sometimes it can be calculated as part of retroactive support. If retroactive support is owing, it can be offset against post-separation spending. So back with the example of a joint account, if there's money in a joint account on the date of separation, I mean, that's both people's money, right? They each own half, technically speaking, although there can be arguments about that not being the case, but they each own half. And then if one party spends all the money in the account, then in theory, they owe the other party what they took after separation.
Right.
So again, that can be calculated as a post-separation adjustment. So it's not a division of property issue, it's a post-separation adjustment issue or potentially a credit to support issue.
Which is
And to
again why the separation date is important. Because if it's argued that the separation date was after the spending, then both would share in that expense.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
And in terms of protecting yourself from depletion of property post-separation, this is another fairly significant issue. So there aren't really any great ways to do this. I mean, if it sometimes you can agree that both parties are not going to make withdrawals off lines of credit and withdraw money from joint accounts, and hopefully that will be something that can be agreed upon. Or a lot of the time, people will agree to maintain the status quo. So mortgage payments come out of the joint account, they continue to deposit their paychecks, things like that. But if somebody's going to take $100,000 out of a line of credit, there's not really anything you can do about that, save and except get a court order for preservation or freezing that line of credit. So those are steps that people do take on an urgent basis if there's any kind of activity like that where a spouse is doing something post-separation that they shouldn't be doing with assets.
Well, and considering I think a lot of marriages fail due to disagreements in financial affairs, that could be an issue more for some than others. And is there any difference between officially being married or just cohabitating and then getting separated? We call it common law, married versus common law, but that's probably not even the right term.
Yeah, there is a significant difference between being married and being unmarried in terms of property division and also support. So married people have an entitlement to an equalization of net family property, which I mentioned before under Ontario law. So it's essentially an assets and debts minus debts calculation for assets accumulated during the marriage. So essentially, when you get married, you're agreeing to be in an economic union with your spouse, and you agree that anything that you accumulate together during the course of the marriage will be shared. Now, there are exceptions to this. There are date of marriage deductions. There are different types of gifts and inheritances are excluded, for example, but generally that's what you're contracting into when you get married. Many people do not know this when they're getting married, that this is what they're contracting into as a married spouse, but that is essentially what it is. Common law spouses do not have a legislated automatic right to divide property. So there is no such thing as an equalization for common law spouses in terms of their property. So what common law spouses have to do is they have to make equitable claims in relation to dividing assets. So there's something called a joint family venture, for example, where a spouse might assert that they should have a division of assets accumulated during the period of cohabitation on the basis that both spouses were working towards common goals and that the property accumulation was a direct result of each spouse's contribution and not just the contribution of the spouse that actually holds the assets. So if you can imagine a situation where there might be a business, but children, and both spouses work in the business, but only one is a shareholder. And one spouse maybe is the primary caregiver of the children. So that spouse might argue that they have a joint family venture. With respect to support, there's some differences in that common law spouses have to cohabitate for 3 years in order to be able to make a claim for spousal support, whereas married people have an automatic right to make a claim for spousal support just by virtue of the fact that they're married. They do not have to wait for 3 years in order to make that claim.
Now, for spousal support, does it matter how many years you are married in terms of how long spousal support may last after you're divorced, or how does that work?
Yes, there is. The spousal support advisory guidelines have been adopted by the courts in determining spousal support. It's not legislation, it's a guideline. However, judges routinely use it. They can depart from the guidelines, but it's essentially gives you, so if you put in the age of the recipient and the length of the cohabitation, it'll generate a range of spousal support, including the amounts and duration. So there is a prescribed formula for that, assuming you're entitled to support in the first place.
Okay, so typically when you separate and eventually get divorced, dividing the assets is done on a, I'm going to say quotation, equitable basis, depending on the situation. What does that typically look like? Like, how are the family assets divided? And what does spousal support typically look like?
So the family assets are not necessarily divided at all unless they're jointly owned. So if it's a jointly owned house, then it would be equally, unless there was a buyout, it would likely be sold and the proceeds would be divided. But if an asset, essentially one spouse is going to owe the other spouse money on account of this equalization calculation. And that can be satisfied in a number of ways. It can be satisfied with a cash payment or a rollover of RRSPs, or, there's various ways that maybe it's a transfer of a pension or portion of a pension. So the how assets are actually divided is going to depend on the circumstances and how that equalization payment is going to be satisfied and whether the assets are owned by both spouses or just one spouse. But effectively, if the asset is in your name, it stays in your name, unless there's a need to liquidate it or sell it in order to pay the other spouse.
Right. So if you think about a couple that's been married for 25 years, they own a home together, maybe they have still a mortgage outstanding. One may have a pension plan, the other one may have RRSPs. They each have tax-free savings accounts, joint bank account, vehicles. Vehicles
Mhm.
might be in individuals. It doesn't mean that if I've got, let's say I have all the RSP and a lot of TFSA and a vehicle in my name and my spouse doesn't, that I keep all of that, right? Like there's
No,
still like the the value needs to get divided between the two parties. How it's
that's
done
correct.
is okay. How it's done, there's a number of different ways you can slice and dice that. But at the end of the day, it's aiming to get some type of an equalization agreement at the end.
That's right. And that's one of the reasons why an amicable separation is advantageous too, is you can come up with various customized ways of dealing with assets that make sense for both spouses.
Yeah,
That's correct.
I'm thinking of a common example where maybe one spouse has a pension, they've been married a long time, they separate, and maybe that pension is divided at source. So then when it does get paid out, part of the pension goes to the one spouse, the other part goes to the other. Or maybe the person that has that pension says, I don't want to split it. I want to keep that. However, you're entitled to some of it, so I'm going to buy you out with a cash payment of whatever that dollar amount equivalent would be. Is that an example that you would see?
That's exactly right. And maybe the other spouse wants to keep the home instead, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
But is it
Yes.
an overly simplified formula for a couple who's been married for many years, to take the value of everything, assets and liabilities, and say, okay, divide it by two? I know it's not that simple because every situation's different, but um, take it all, divide it by two. That's the dollar amount each person's entitled to. And then they start picking away at who wants what, who wants the home, who wants the pension, and figure it out from there.
I would say that's generally how it is. People usually have opinions about what they want to keep in terms of if they can keep the house they want to for the children maybe, or something like, or maybe they really love the cottage. So sometimes people really want to keep certain assets, but that's effectively what it is. And sometimes we do have to do that equalization calculation, or we have to find out how much is everything worth? What are the tax implications that are associated with everything? What is the net value? And then people can decide, well, what can I afford to keep? And if you're keeping a house, can I qualify for the mortgage for the house? And those kinds of things. So you really do need to have all the numbers in order to come to an agreement. How much support am I going to get?
Right.
Am I going to be able to afford the mortgage with the support I'm going to get? Those kinds of things. So it's all interrelated.
Yes.
Um, mhm.
And then we're almost out of time, so we're not going to have a chance to go through everything. But how does child support and spousal support work?
So child support is governed by the child support guidelines, and it's essentially you make X and you pay Y for the number of children. If there's a shared parenting situation, which is 50-50 or 60-40, anywhere above 40-60, then often both spouses will pay support to each other, but effectively it's a table amount that's legislated. So the complexity in that is really determining income, which is a very disputed issue in family law. And we often have to get experts involved to determine income. If you're not a T4 salaried employee, sometimes that can be complicated. And that's, it's a
Right.
good idea. It's a good idea to involve an expert for an income report if income is disputed and there's multiple income sources, self-employment income, things like that. And that's really essentially how child support works, though. Child support is much more straightforward than spousal support. Spousal support can be more complicated depending on a number of factors, including, the role the spouse performed during the relationship, the length of the relationship, their own ability to achieve self-sufficiency. There's a lot of arguments about imputing income to a spouse who may be underemployed, things like that. So spousal support can be more complicated in that regard.
Yeah, I think the more I hear, the more I realize seeking professional advice is really invaluable. And every situation is different, but you want to make sure that you're getting what you're entitled to so that you can be financially independent and take care of yourself in the years ahead and both parties can have a happy life ahead. Allison, if people want to get
Absolutely.
more information and reach out to you, where can they go?
So my contact information is on our firm's website, which is Dixon Appel LLP. So the website address is www.dixonappel.com, which is spelled DICKSONAPPELL.com. And it's
Wonderful.
also my LinkedIn profile if you can find me on LinkedIn.
Allison, thank you so much for your time today. I think we just scratched the surface. A deeper dive would be encouraged for all, but appreciate
Yeah,
having you here today.
it's a lot to cover. Thank you for having me, Sybil. I really enjoyed being here.
And what would you like us to cover in a future masterclass? Send us a message. We love hearing from you. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And for access to resources to help you live your version of a wealthy life, join the Wealthy Life Club for free. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.